This is our second lesson on the origin of evil from a Second Temple perspective. Before we get to the content this week, I want to share a testimony from Brother Kenneth Hagin, a man who's in heaven now that I greatly respect because I think there's some wisdom in it. He shared, I've heard him share, about a friend of his named Brother Goodwin. I actually got to fellowship with one of Brother Goodwin's spiritual sons. So I've actually heard this testimony from two different angles, from both Brother Hagin on tape and one of Brother Goodwin's sons in fellowship. But Brother Hagin and Brother Goodwin would get together and they would discuss the Bible. And the thing about it is they didn't always agree. And one of the things they didn't agree on is part of this subject that we're talking about in this series of lessons. However, Brother Hagin said that he would travel hundreds of miles out of the way to agree with Brother Goodwin in prayer because he said they never agreed on anything in prayer that didn't come to pass. And at Brother Goodwin's funeral, Brother Hagin said he never met another man with extent of knowledge of the Word of God that Brother Goodwin had. So I wanted to proceed with that in mind, to know that if you don't agree with me on this, that's fine. I'm just putting another perspective out there, and we don't have to let it harm our fellowship or whatever. But this is something to look at. So with that, we'll proceed. Last week we introduced and we talked about the traditional view of the origin of evil, that somewhere in primeval past, that a third of the angels and Satan rebelled against God and were cast out of heaven, out beyond Pluto somewhere. And I pointed out that you don't find a scriptural record of this per se. It actually comes from Paradise Lost. It's a literary work from the 1600s. But we went through last week and went through the scripture and shown how a lot of the scriptures that we use to prove the Paradise Lost paradigm doesn't really fit the context of the scriptures and what they're talking about. And I'm not going to rehash all of that. If you missed that, you probably want to go back and watch it. But this week we're going to zoom in on the fall of Satan, from what I believe is the scriptural account. It says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other of the wild animals the Lord had made. And he said to the woman, 'Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat from the fruit in the trees of the garden, but God did say, you must not eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.'" So I'm just going to break this account in pieces. First of all, it says the serpent was more crafty. Crafty is arum, and it's translated prudent throughout Proverbs, and it's in a positive context all throughout Proverbs. I think we put crafty back in it because we know how the story ends, but actually this word is not a bad word. It's where it says the prudent man foresees evil and hides himself, and it talks about a person who is wise and a good problem solver and full of godly wisdom. And the second question, why would a woman carry on a conversation with a snake? Well, this wasn't your garden variety snake, nor was this an ordinary garden. We actually talked about this in our lesson on sacred space, but it bears repeating. Eden was where heaven and earth overlapped. See, God said when he established creation, he said it was good, but he didn't say perfect. There is a Hebrew word for perfect. He said good. Only the Garden of Eden was perfect. But man was supposed to assist God in establishing and spreading Eden throughout the whole rest of the earth. And because of sin and because of the falls that we're going to talk about, that program was put on pause. God had to quarantine his people and quarantine them down to the nation of Israel. And then through Israel came the Messiah. And then the New Testament is a relaunch of that Eden mandate. Another thing we're going to have to, before we proceed, we're going to look at some different spiritual beings. We've had kind of a very limited understanding of spiritual beings. We know about angels and demons and whatever that may be. And that's about it. But let's look at some different spiritual beings that will be important to this lesson. First of all, cherubim. Ezekiel 1 verses 4 through 11. I looked and saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. In the center of the fire looked like glowing metal. Make a mental note of that because that'll be important later. And in that fire was what looked like 4 living creatures in appearance. Their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. And under their wings, also note bronze, that's also important. Under their wings on all 4 sides they had human hands, and all of them had faces and wings, and the wings of the one touched the wings of another. And each went straight ahead, and they did not turn as they moved. And their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being on the right side, and had the face of the lion on the left, and a face of an ox. And also each had a face of an eagle, and such were their faces. They had 2 wings spreading out and upward, and each wing touching that of the creature on either side. And each had other wings covering its body. Now, if we go on in Ezekiel 9:3, Ezekiel identifies these creatures as cherubim. See, a lot of people, whenever they think of cherubim, they think of little fat baby ornaments out in their garden, but that's not what a cherubim is. A cherubim were these intimidating throne guardians that look like animal man mashups. They were meant to be intimidating because they guarded sacred space. And you see these all throughout ancient Near Eastern iconography. You've seen these. It's widespread. It's universal. Also, there is seraphim. We see these in Isaiah 6. Now, a seraphim is a subset of the cherubim, and they are a serpent throne guardian. So that's, remember, Eden was where heaven and earth overlapped. So that's why there was a serpent in the garden. This serpent was one of these throne guardians. And that's why Eve was carrying on a conversation with a snake. We also know this is not a snake because the New Testament, which is an inspired commentary of the Old Testament, tells us so. And we read it last week, Revelation 12:9. A great red dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. So we know that that serpent wasn't really a serpent. It was what would become to be known in New Testament theology that developed during Second Temple time as the Satan, the accuser. I want to look at this word for serpent. It's the Hebrew word nakash. And there's the neat thing about Hebrew is I think there's a word play going on here because the original Hebrew didn't have vowels. So if you take the vowels out of nakash for serpent, you can also get nochesh, which speaks of a diviner. Divination is hidden wisdom revealed from the spiritual dimension. It's both used in a positive and negative context in the Bible. It talks, I think it says in Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, that divination is on the lips of the king because because he's God's anointed. He speaks the wisdom of God from the unseen realm. So that fits the characteristic, that fits the serpent in Genesis 3. He dispensed knowledge from the unseen realm. Now, granted, it was twisted. Granted, it wasn't the whole truth. But this is what Satan did. He gave them information from the spiritual dimension. Also, from that word, you can get the Aramaic word for copper. What is the characteristic of copper? Copper is shiny. Remember when we saw the vision of the throne room, we saw luminescence, we saw shining, we saw copper, we saw all these. These are all imagery of sacred space. So luminescence is an attribute of spiritual beings. And we do things like that in English. We kind of have these word plays, unless you think that sounds strange, to consider the sentence, which may be fitting. Some are not content with this content. Well, we see two different words spelled the same way, but because you speak English, you just intuit that one is content and one's content. That's what you kind of got going on. So the ancient reader, when they read serpent, they would probably see these layers of meaning in that word, in that Hebrew word. Now let's pick back up in Genesis 3. Genesis 3, 14 and 15. Now the Lord said to the serpent, because you've done this, you're cursed above all livestock and all wild animals. You'll crawl on your belly and you'll eat dust all the days of your life. And I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Now I mentioned last week that on your belly you'll go, had an ancient Near Eastern context. And I said I may get to it. Well, here we are. This wasn't the serpent once had legs and God took his legs away and some kind of evolutionary model. No, you will crawl on your belly is found all throughout ancient Near Eastern literature to speak of a serpent going from the attack position. You got to think, if you look at all the iconography, most of the throne guardian serpents were cobras. A cobra, when it's in attack position, is standing upright. When it's on its belly, that means it's no longer in the attack position. It's been subdued. And so when he said on your belly you're going to go, he's talking about subduing the serpent. And also, you will eat dust. All throughout ancient Near Eastern literature, this is what the inhabitants of the underworld ate. So, get ready. This is the record of the fall of Satan. Not some primeval rebellion. This is the record of it. This is where Satan fell. This is where Satan was cast down to the underworld, cast down to the ground. We read it last week, Isaiah 14. We'll look at verse 4 and then verse 12. You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, how the oppressor has come to an end, how his fury has ended, how you've fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You've been cast down to the earth, who once laid low the nations. I forgot to mention this last week. The word taunt is mashal, and it's a comparative parable. And we talked about last week, he's actually speaking to an earthly king using a comparative parable of the fall of the Satan figure. The fall of Satan, he uses it as a comparative parable against this king. And remember how that terminology is used. We read it last week, but we're here for review. Luke 10:15, you Capernaum are exalted to heaven, will be brought down to Hades. Was Capernaum a city up in heaven? No, it's the way biblical poetic literature speaks of a fallen rank, a fall from one status to another. Lamentations 2:1, he has hurled down the splendor of Israel from heaven to earth. He's not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. So Israel wasn't in heaven as beyond Pluto. It's figurative language of being cast down. So we have to let the Bible interpret the Bible. So whenever it talks about Satan being cast down, he was in Eden as a throne guardian, and he was cast down from that. Where it says cast down to earth, that word earth is the Greek word, or the Hebrew word eretz, and it's a word for the underworld. So because man heeded the serpent, heeded Satan, man fell and became subject to death. Satan then became the Lord of the dead because he was cast down to the underworld, where his place was, is in the underworld. And when people died, they stayed dead. That made Satan Lord over them. But the Messiah would someday undo this through the resurrection. Through the resurrection, he conquered death. He conquered the Lord of the dead. And we'll probably get more into this concept later. Ezekiel 28 is another one of these mashals, one of these comparative parables about the king of Tyre. He says, you were in Eden, the garden of God. This gives the location of the fall. You were in Eden, the garden of God. It wasn't in heaven out beyond Pluto. Every precious stone adorned you: carnelian, chrysolite, emerald, topaz, onyx, and jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and beryl. Your settings and your mountings were pure gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. See, this mirrors the garment of the priesthood who occupied sacred space. This is all telegraphing things. This is all telegraphing information on where this fall happened. It happened in sacred space in the garden. And he goes on to say, you were the anointed cherub, for I so ordained you. You were the guardian cherub. What was a cherubim? What was a seraphim? It was a throne guardian. It was a guardian of sacred space. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked among the fiery stones. Remember, that's luminescence, telegraphs the spiritual dimension. And the mountain of God was Garden of Eden. That's why Mount Zion was God's city, was on a mountain, because it was Eden imagery. That's why Moses met with God on a mountain. It was Eden imagery, because Eden was the mountain of God. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence and you sinned. And I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God and expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud because of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom. Because of your splendor, I threw you to the earth. Remember, he cast him down to the earth to eat dust. And I made you a spectacle before kings. Now that account kind of pivots back and forth between the natural king using the Satan fall narrative, because of your trade and all these other things. So also, because of the fall of Satan, because man yielded to Satan, man also fell, and you start to see the effects of that yielding to Satan start to take place. Genesis 3:16, he says to the woman, you'll want to control your husband, but he'll dominate you. If you first see an attack on the family unit, you see witchcraft and manipulation. You'll want to control your husband. He'll want to dominate you. And you'll see the one thing that God didn't give man dominion over is what they begin to want to take dominion, and that's on other people. Anytime somebody tries to control you with fear and manipulation, you know that Satan's at work, because it's a result of the fall. It's a twisting and it's a perversion of man's natural desire to rule and reign with God. But now it's projected on other people, which we don't have authority over. Then we see Cain murder his brother in an act of worship. And then Cain cries out to God, and God has mercy on him. Cain builds a city, and just, I'm abbreviating this a bunch. So much is going on, and you're seeing how not Eden societies become, and these cities, how non-Eden they are. Then Cain has a descendant named Lamech in this city. He's actually the first mention of polygamy in the Bible, was Lamech. So you're seeing the fall begin to affect the family unit. If you spell his name backwards, it's king spelled backward, which speaks of reversal of dominion. You're seeing a reversal of dominion take place. Then he sings a song, which is like a prehistoric Bohemian Rhapsody. The scholars call it the Song of the Sword. Genesis 4:23 and 24, the wives of Lamech, hear my words. I've killed a man for wounded me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. You see, because of the fall, a twisting in man's thinking that starts to happen. He used Cain's forgiveness as a license for sin. And that's a human tendency because of the fall that we have to be careful of. When we see somebody, including ourselves, not get their comeuppance for something, you see them acting in a way that's not unbecoming and not right, and because you don't see the effects immediately, it will create a license to sin. That sin's not a big deal. I heard a quote recently: sin wouldn't be as enticing if the wages were paid immediately. And something else we got to be careful. If God starts dealing with some aspect of character that we need to develop, and yet because for the sake of the people, God continues to use us to minister blessing to people, and God continues to bless us. We've got to be careful that same serpent figure don't whisper in your ear, see, it's not that big a deal after all. That thing God's dealing with you, it's not a big deal. See how God's using you. See how God's blessing you. Well, God's blessing on you is not a divine stamp on all your behavior. And I'll say this, it's may shock you, but even having miracles in your life is not a divine stamp on everything you say and do. It's the gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. And those gifts and callings of God, we see Samson, who was messing with prostitutes and breaking his Nazirite vow and everything else, tearing the city gates off by the power of God. That eventually caught up to him. It took 20 years, but in 20 years it finally came home to roost. So that's why we have to, when God deals with stuff, we can't see God's mercy as license to keep doing what we're doing. In this lesson, we look briefly at the fall of man and the fall of Satan. Unfortunately, that's where much of the church and much of Christian thought ends, but not so in the Second Temple perspective. We still have 2 more falls to cover, so stay tuned.